that everyone pays attention to how you responded to the detailed assessor reports. So that's the first thing. They really, like, I know everyone who's experienced knows this, but it's just unbelievable how something that might have come in right down the bottom of the next band actually can go straight up to almost the top, not quite to the top, but absolutely go into a solid area within the fundable. And I was quite gobsmacked that could happen. So I'm saying, you know, really take this rejoinder seriously, because it can make such a big difference to where your application is ranked. Now, things that happen that I noticed are that because the general assessors actually assess across, I see so many applications, which is so different to a detailed assessor who might only see a few. The general assessors, as you can imagine, see hundreds. And so they're quite good at being able to say, actually, where does your application sit? And if say, for instance, all of the detailed assessors have given it a C, which is, you know, going to drop it right within the second band, at least, maybe even the bottom band, depending on how many A's and B's were given, then they'll look at your application, they'll look at the assessor reports and what they criticised, and they'll look at your rejoinder. And and because the general assessors see so many, they can actually say, these are detailed assessors, who of course not as experienced at seeing so many, actually a bit harsh. And so they can lift it by saying that the A's that were given, or the C's that were given, should have really been a B. So that's the first thing that they can do. The second thing they can do, but only then if you've responded really well in your rejoinder to the criticisms. And even though the general assessors might not know as much as the detailed assessors about the particular area, and if the criticisms made of your project were quite technical, then the general assessors actually are not shy to go and do Google searches, and actually I find information they need to actually to be able to make a fair judgment around how your rejoinder has addressed the issue that was raised by the detailed assessors. And they're also not shy to check your references, you know, your claims, and they're not shy to see whether, you know, you've reported, and this is not in your rejoinder, but in your application, you've reported that you are, you know, the top person in this field. They'll actually go and have a look and see if that's really true. So it's to say the rejoinder is critical because it lifts you into the fundable grouping. If you do it well, you have to be very persuasive. You have to be very clear, and different people will give you different advice about the comments. My experience, and of course, I guess it depends on everyone's experience, but my experience is that when you receive your reports and you're writing your response, there is what I call the tone of your response, and there's nothing more irritating to a general assessor to have a rejoinder that's a bit grumpy. And you can really feel that when you're reading it. So keep that in mind. Think about the tone that you present, and in terms of how you're responding. Also, really important, underscore this 100 times, is you have to respond to everything that the detailed assessors actually said, because the general assessors will be looking for that. How did you respond to that? And if you ignore it, they will notice it. They are really very careful with what they do, because they recognise that this is, you know, you're putting a lot of time and effort into this, and they're matching that with a lot of effort to really make a judgment about your response to the detailed assessors. So make sure you don't miss anything out. I know that can feel overwhelming if all the assessors, for instance, gave different responses, and gave many criticisms. You've got to try and work out within that 5,000 characters, a very carefully crafted response to respond. So don't give a grumpy response, and don't miss anything out. It's really important. So really use this almost like a ticket to lift, like a flight ticket to lift you straight into that fundable grouping. Now, if your proposal is generally very weak and you still give a good rejoinder, it will never get you into the fundable category. But if your proposal is very good, it's a strong proposal, and the assessors have been mean, and you don't always know, because sometimes, as Sharon said, sometimes a response that someone gives, you know, critical A, critical B, critical C, and you read it and you go, oh no, I've got a really low score. Actually, it's not really true. Sometimes they actually have a very high score, but the assessor is engaging. Try and read it as engagement with your proposal, and that the detailed assessors have given. And so they might be very critical because they've been really engaged in it. And they may not have been very succinct in what they noticed, because not all, the assessors are also busy people too. So perhaps they don't always do what they need. I think there's a little bit of feedback again. I was wondering if we just do a check that you're on mute, somebody who's got a lot of background noise.
I think that, kids, can you stop? I don't think I've muted.
Okay, that's better. Beautiful, thank you. Where was I? So then, and I've forgotten where I was. So let me launch into another point. What I also noticed was that that you can have the opposite, where somebody gives very gushing comments, and then what they do is give you a very mundane score of a B, for instance, or even a C. And so that's probably the hardest one for you, because as you don't know what score you've got. All you know is you have the comments. And so then you have to, if you've got lots and lots of very positive comments, then it becomes tricky about what to do, because you can't add new information to your proposal. That's not allowed. And you can't add new information through the rejoinder to the proposal. But it may be that you'll have to think about a clever response. So for instance, and I'll give the example of my Laureate Fellowship application, when I got my detailed assessor responses, I got very, very nice comments. And Luke from Central said to me, he said, this is going to be the hardest rejoinder you have ever had to write, because you've got nothing to engage with. Fortunately, there was a report that had come out during the assessment process, and I know you're not supposed to add new information, but what I did was I took the chief scientist's report, and what I did was basically make the argument that because the detailed assessors could see the worth of this in the context of this report, which says unless we do take action now, we're going to miss this moment in time. And so what I did was I used the report basically as a tool to tell the general assessors why my application had to be funded, that they couldn't not fund it. So you need to be, and this is where Sharon and Trudy and others and Mandy and even experienced people that are listening today can support the process. Think about, if you get one of those glowing ones, how are you going to deal with it? And when you get lots of negative ones, if you get too many negative comments, it's of course much harder to write a response when you have to deal with every single one. But none of what I'm saying is probably new, but I just want to underscore that your rejoinder is so critical to take you up. If you've already got a good proposal and your assessors have been mean, it will still get up. It potentially will get up into that category of fundable, and that's what you're seeking to do. Now I'm just looking at the table to see if there's anything else I should. Yes, don't argue with the assessors. Don't argue with the assessors. That really, I noticed gets general assessors really annoyed. And the other thing that I noticed, and that you may have some experience of this, that more the people that have done this many times over and been successful. One of the things I had been advised at one point was to make sure I tell the general assessors that the detailed assessors thought my application was wonderful, and then just put in a few quotes. What I learned was actually you're wasting space doing that. You know, just keep it really short. You know, assessors were all positive, and then go on to address the negative, unless of course you want to pull something out specific to the positive comment. But but save the words, because as I mentioned, the general assessors, they really read the reports. So why repeat it? They all read your application, and they'll follow things up. So they do pay very close attention to what you're presenting. So you don't need to tell the assessors, the general assessors in your rejoinder, yet again, what the detailed assessors have said, because they'll read it anyway. So I'm going to leave it there, and I haven't been reading the comments section, but it would be great if you could all now ask questions verbally, and Sharon, Mandy and I can respond, but I think also we have many other people who've been very successful before who could also contribute, because I know Trudy also has a lot of experience too of advising people. So not just me to respond, but we just have a general open discussion now. And I'll hand back to Mandy or Sharon.
Yeah, thanks Marilyn, that's great. Yeah, please feel free for people to put in the chat if it's easier for you to do that, or just to put up your hand and talk with us. I'm going to attempt to make this my people bigger here so I can see if there's hands up. Maybe Marilyn, could you say a couple more words about what to do with positive comments? So you talked a little bit about it. So should you be drawing on positive comments, or ignore the positive comments because they're positive and you go directly to the critiques?
Yeah, I guess if you've got nothing but positive comments, then my earlier comment stands, which is think of a clever way that you can really put out there that this has to be funded. You know, don't miss the opportunity, general assessors. If you've got some good comments across the board and a few negatives, sometimes you can use one against the other. You know, you can say 3 of the assessors found the method to be really robust, whilst, you know, assessor D questioned it, and then address what the question was in as much detail as you can, so that the general assessor can say, oh yeah, there's no problems with this. This person was just being a bit picky, or they might say, actually, there is a problem, but the rejoinder says that they've picked up on it and thanked the assessor D, and now they're going to do what the assessor D has suggested. I've done that in successful bids where a criticism, people were saying, you know, positive things, and then I use that, and then I mentioned a response to a detailed assessor who had said, but you're not showcasing the research throughout the period. And I said something, so that was something they thought was really important. And so I just said, fantastic ideas, we'll reallocate in the budget to spread the cost of translation and communication of the findings throughout the period. So, you know, I took up the idea and engaged with it. I know that's not quite what you're asking, Mandy.
No, but that's a really good point, actually, because in terms of, you know, if there are suggestions about how you manage that, and it's okay to take up suggestions from the assessors in that way. But then I think going back to my earlier point, I think you also have addressed that in terms of be careful not to play one assessor off against the other, but point out where there may be strengths that have been highlighted by other assessors that it may be different from what one assessor says.
Yeah, that's great, Mandy. Would somebody else like to respond as well to while people are thinking of questions to that point, that have tried different techniques? very good with our wait time, aren't we?
Aren't we? I'll put my video on. Hopefully that won't interfere with the sound too much.
Does anyone have a burning question? So did we miss Sharon? Did we miss any questions? Or you can't see the questions, can you?
Oh, I can now. And there were some questions about how...
No,
oh, sorry, go Sharon.
yeah, there was just... Sorry, yeah, there was just a question, in case people haven't seen it in the chat. There was a question around sort of the actual structure of the rejoinder, and someone, I think it was Laura, was asking whether you can put a table in. Is that the best way? And I was explaining that you can't use any tables within the rejoinder. But I also said that in the examples that I'll email around to everyone, it'll show a good way to sort of abbreviate text so you can fit more information within the actual rejoinder text box. So that was one question that came around.
Okay, I'll just add to that, Sharon, while you're looking at the other questions. Laura, I think you asked a question earlier on about you'll be lucky enough to get a report. You'll definitely get assessor reports. Everyone does. It's just you're lucky if you get lots. Just to underscore Sharon's point, that because you've got a very linear way of presenting back, and because you're having to save text in order to say everything you need to, it can be very challenging. And so I've used different techniques, and I'm looking forward to seeing what Sharon's going to send round. But I've used ASSA, so assessor A, ASSB, assessor B, and then responded. And sometimes I've done like you do with referencing. What I've also done is make a general comment, just say assessors, and then put ABC, all stated that, and then you can respond to it. So that's another way to save a bit of text, because if you have to keep writing assessor, assessor, assessor. The other thing to keep in mind is that don't use too many acronyms. I know that that may be a little bit specific to your proposal, like general acronyms like STEM, everyone knows. But if you've got, say, Internet of Toys or something, and you use IO Toys, and it's not their area, and they're looking at it, the general assessors will get a little bit annoyed reading your rejoinder, because they have to keep checking to see what your acronym meant. But have a think about that, unless you really put it right up the top or something, so they know and they can look up and then keep going. Because remember you know they're busy, and you don't want to annoy them by getting them to waste time searching for things. So structure and how you present it's really important. It's just like when you're making student assignments, isn't it, really? It's if you've got to do too much hunting, you get a bit grumpy as an assessor, and it reflects even though you don't want it to, but it can. And don't have any typos in it. No typos.
Check and double check.
Because otherwise it gives an impression that you're a bit sloppy. So even get somebody else to look at it for you if you can't see it, if you've become text blind because you're doing this at midnight or something and it's due the next day.
Yeah. I'll quickly share, if you like, maybe this is what Sharon is intending to share with everybody, but this is what we received from the MRO as a kind of template for responding. So I'll just do a screen share here, and just moving this one out of the way.
Yes, that is one of the examples I was going to share.
Yes, right. So they sort of pull apart, so effective rejoinder example, and they the things that Marilyn has already talked about, you know, what the ARC panel is likely to spend only a few moments. And will they say most of that time may be spent discussing the budget? So there's some particular ways in which you can abbreviate. Suggested again what Marilyn's talked about, being readable and clear and easy on the eye. So that's another point, I think, in terms of space. Maybe wanted to think about how you organise so that it doesn't look too dense for somebody to read it. So this is what we'll share with you that gives a little bit more specific examples where words to avoid like concern or criticism, where that may direct people to see, oh, there was actually a problem with what you were proposing, and they're suggesting lighter words here. And this goes back to the point at the beginning, it's not necessary to use all the space, you know, it can be better to be succinct. So just because you have that many characters, you don't have to use them all in order to be hitting the points that you need. And so, yeah, this will give you some different kinds of examples as well. And what we all love to read, an ineffective rejoinder example. And you can see just in the difference of the layout compared with the one earlier about how much easier it is to look at. And there may well be people here experience, Paul, Marilyn, for instance, you and talk about something that might seem inconsequential, but that actually has an impact on how somebody reads your rejoinder.
Yeah, it's so true, because when the assessors, general assessors, are reading so many of them, then it's much easier to have a nice clean bang, 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 bang. And particularly if you've read, because as an assessor, when you're reading the detailed assessor reports, you're going, oh, that's a worry, that's a worry, that's a worry. But then when you get to the rejoinder and you read it, you go, oh, actually, this is a really good response to that, and it's very quick to find it in the way that Mandy was alluding to. That it's very clear, it's very easy to find it, and to respond to it, and always in sort of in a constructive way, which I think is what that example you were showing, Mandy, was suggesting, and that foregrounds me saying what I said earlier on. You know, don't give a grumpy response. Paul, do you want to make any comments? Oh, sorry, is that Sharon?
Oh, unless Paul wants to step in. I just had a general question.
No, I'll wait.
You're okay? Yeah, so Marilyn, I just wanted to ask, can you make anything of the fact that sometimes you might get, say, 5 assessor reports and sometimes you get a lot less? Does that mean anything?
No, not at all. It just means that when the ARC put out their requests, some people just didn't respond, or they couldn't find someone. It's more to do with availability of assessors than it is to do, and the general assessors, when they're looking at 2 reports versus 5 reports, they have to work a bit harder. That's all. You know, you have to go back and actually be almost like a detailed assessor and have a look at the application as well, so that you can to see whether, particularly if it's not something you know a lot about. Now, the person who's the carriage for your application and is looking at taking that forward, that person would have gone through your application with a fine tooth comb, depending on how much time they have, and also how many they've been given, because they tend to, if you imagine the carriage person will have a subset of the whole lot, and they will look at, say they might be carriage for 10 applications, for instance, or more. I don't know across all the schemes how many they have, because I guess it depends on what the big pool is. So I would imagine DPs and LPs will have a lot more applications than will be the DECRAs and so on. So across the board, the carriage person will really look closely. So if you have only 2 detailed assessor reports, then the general assessor will almost act like a proxy. They'll look at it very closely, and they should have some knowledge, not always, but they should have some knowledge of the area or the methodology or something, to have some affinity with it, so that they can and they make recommendations, but so does everyone else. And the thing that I didn't mention, that in the rank ordering process, is that the general assessors, everybody looks at So there might be a carriage and a group of people who are looking and being the experts for that cluster of applications, but everybody who's on the assessment panel, the general assessment panel, looks at all of the applications, and they all have an opportunity to discuss it, and they vote. This is the thing that I found really interesting. So that the person who's looked at your application, looked at so the carriage person who's looked at your rejoinder will say some words to orient everybody to it. What were the problems? What were the strengths? And their views, and the other people in the team will also comment. And then what happens is as part of the process is that everybody listens to that advice, and then there's some general discussion, clarification, and then a decision is, not a decision is made, but the carriage the carriage leader, the leader will say, I recommend this go into the fundable category, or I recommend, it doesn't. And, or that the score should be X, Y, Z. And then people vote to support it or not. So it just gives you a bit of an idea about the process. And so you can see how your rejoinder really matters, because it's going to persuade the carriage leader, the person who's leading the team. And then when they talk to it, that's in turn, they're talking on your behalf about how you've addressed all the concerns and why their proposal is really exciting or not. And then everybody who's also read all of that content has listened to that. Remember, they're doing lots of them over 2 days. It takes 2 days at least. Then they vote, and then it goes to where it needs to be. Is it fundable or is it not fundable? And when they say it's fundable, then the scores are allocated accordingly, and then it's reorganised within the ranking system. So do you see how it moves up? So that, again, that's why the rejoinder is so important. But I'm going to pass back to Paul now, because Paul, you're going to say something.
I think it's an interesting process you've described too, but what I've been told, Marilyn, is that it takes somewhere between 2 and 5 minutes to do that. In other words, you get quite, assessors are doing a whole lot of reviewing, and if your advocate thinks it's not very good, well, it doesn't get a lot of time.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think, again, I guess it depends on the scheme, because I've only been involved in one scheme, but the scheme I was involved in, over the 2 days, every proposal had half an hour allocated to it. Yeah, but prior to that, everybody had discussions offline as well about proposals. But maybe if we're looking at DPs, for instance, where there's many more applications, maybe, of course, it has to be truncated down. So I think that's probably the difference. Maybe it's just the scheme I was in, that there was not as many, and I don't know the figures. I don't know, Trudy, do you know, or Mandy, do you know how many applications there are approximately each year for the DP scheme?
Trudy's left, and I don't know, maybe Paul or Sharon have a sense, but yeah, were you involved in a more selective scheme, like the Laureate scheme? Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
So
so there's not as many. Yeah,
that's right. And as Paul said, there's much less time when obviously the volume is greater, the number is.
Yeah, so it's important to keep what Paul's alluding to keep that in mind as well, depending on the scheme you're applying for. So if you're doing DECRAs, for instance, I imagine there's less applications for DECRAs. I don't know. It'd be interesting. It would be a really interesting thing to find out, actually. I should imagine that information MRO should have access to it. But thanks, Paul. That's really helpful.
The other comment I was going to make is that the more open rejoinder, like the MRO has promoted, what the explanation that's been given to me in the past is the people who are reviewing these things are doing them late at night. They're tired. They've got many of them to look at. And realistically, they're probably, exhausted by the process. If you make it hard for them to read, just the actual reading process, psychologically, it has a negative impact on you know, even on the best will in the world, you're tired. And if the points are not really, really clear, and particularly argumentative, I've read some argumentative rejoinders. One which sticks in my mind where the person said, well, if you want to know about the methodology, go and read my book. Now, that's how to commit suicide, you know, in one foul swoop, I would think.
Absolutely.
Particularly where methodology was the question that was being really, really asked about. But I've always taken that to heart, is that if it's hard to read, like blocks of paragraph, you know, blocks of text, a reviewer is going to get very tired very quickly. Anyway, that's my comment.
Yeah. Oh, and Paul, so while you're there, obviously you've written quite a number of rejoinders then, and in the past, and can you sort of single out some insights related to projects that were successful compared to ones that were unsuccessful, in terms of what you put into the rejoinder or how you framed it, besides the things that you've just said?
In the early days, I think we thanked the reviewers for making positive comments, which was a huge waste of time. And I think also, as Marilyn said, I think it's a really important point, and Peter Sullivan used to say this, and I've heard from Bonnie Barber, who was on the College of Experts at one stage as well. If you've got complementary pieces, it's a total waste of time thanking the reviewers. Although also, I think you actually need to say right at the top, you know, we thank the reviewers for their insightful comments or something, because the people who are reviewing them have also been reviewers and writers of these, you know, reviews over the years. And people do it for, I mean, I've got 3 sitting here now that I've got to do before whatever date is in June. And, you know, most people do it on the weekend. So it's like you're fitting it in the cracks. And I think being respectful, even if you've got some really tough criticism. The thing I always sit down when Helen White and I have always worked together on these things, we sit down and actually pull the whole review. I mean, if we've got 3 reviews and 2 of them agree about a methodological issue or some substantive issue, I mean, I think you really do have to actually, you know, systematically address those things. And our approach has always been to pull the reviews apart and not to try and ignore anything in them. And I think the dangerous one, Marilyn, that you said, is where you get complimentary reviews and then you're not sure what to do with them because you don't know what your score is.
Exactly.
Some people, I think, are a bit concerned about making critical comments sometimes. You know, the reviewers are a bit concerned, oh, well, I don't want to hurt their feelings. And then you get a really bad score, like a B or a C. Well,
it's not very helpful then, is it?
No.
No, yeah, it can be quite confusing. No. And I think your point then is a very important one, Paul, is that, you know, what do you do first? And even if you're not, you know, you can't put a table into the rejoinder, but you can set up a table as you might, you know, in responding to a journal article, to just deconstruct the critique to begin with, pulling out the points and thinking about them individually and how you might start to address them. So that the first steps that you take become crucial in actually figuring out what it is that you should be paying attention to within those different sets of reviews.
Yeah, and sometimes too. Sorry, Paul, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, we always look for the sleeper sentence.
Yeah. I was just going to talk about that too. That's great. Go ahead.
No, you go now. I mean, they're the ones we look for.
Yeah.
And they're sometimes hard to detect. Like, if someone says about a candidate, for instance, in a DECRA, it is a pity that the candidate couldn't actually identify their own publications so that they could be, you know, like really bad. I reviewed one recently where the candidate had, all of the references had no publication details. So there were publication details like the journal article or it was a conference paper, but there were no, you know, what was the date, what was the year, what was the page numbers.
Oh dear, that's terrible.
Well, all I'm saying is that I mean, you know, the criticism you make is it is a pity Well, that's the sleeper sentence. It just says
Yeah,
you
it's
did
a pity.
suicide, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah, sleeper, more like nightmare than sleeper in that case.
Yeah. The other sleeper one that to look for is if they say when they're trying to talk about the innovation in your research, if you get comments like something like the method is a trusted method or something like that in the context, you know, because we can read into that they can either be saying it's robust or they can be saying boring, you know, and what detailed assessors often are looking for is not functional proposals. They're looking for something that gets them a bit excited, and so have a look, read your detailed assessor reports to see if you think you got them excited, and if there's nothing in there that suggests any level of excitement, then that's going to be a hard one to address, because it's like Paul's saying, it's the sleeper comment. You've got to try and second guess the fact that they've given a low score. So then you might say, under the, you know, trust, you might say something like, yes, and, you know, assessor A said this was a trustworthy method. The innovation that we have adopted extends this by blah, 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 blah. And so you're kind of second guessing, or because then you're not being critical. What you're doing is you're addressing maybe that point, because it may have also been a very lazy reviewer as well. And I have to say, when I've been looking at rejoinders and detailed assessors reports, sometimes it's led me to the conclusion that sometimes every now and then there's quite a lazy response to and the lazy response might be because the person was so busy and they had to do it, you know, the night before it was due, Paul, for instance. And that can happen, and that's okay if it happens occasionally. But you've got to then work a bit harder with your rejoinder, because they haven't really given much for you to engage with, because they've been a bit lazy. They've just said, "Oh, this is great," you know, and then still given it an ordinary score. Because that's easier for them to just drop the score than it is to put a lot of writing into why they felt it was a C and not a B, for instance. So you're having to do a bit of second guessing there. So I think that Paul's point's important as part of the deconstructing process. And Mandy, you're right, having a process by which you can go through, like with tables like reviewers do, and then from that construct your narrative. I think that's a good way. It's a good systematic way to work, because then I tend to have the step before that, which is I get the reports out on the table with a highlighter and I mark every bit that's negative that I feel I need to address. And then I start to work out how to cluster it. So that's, you know, it's a bit sort of it's like you're analysing data. You're looking for patterns, really. Treat it, and again, treat this process, the rejoinder, it might seem like a daunting thing in some ways if it's the first time you're doing it, but take it so seriously, because it can really lift your application. It really can, as I said, into the fundable category. Because even if your reviews are shocking and your score is shocking, if the general assessors disagree, they put it up. Absolutely put it up. They discuss it, the carriage with the group discuss it, and then they present it to the rest of the assessment panel. And they make a case for why, you know, this was, you know, should be a lot higher, and then they just adjust it. It's unbelievable. I couldn't believe how it could jump. I always thought it would just be a matter of, oh yeah, just moving up 1 or 2, but no, it can just escalate straight up. It's unbelievable, and the opposite too.
Yeah, and that's why this is what the emphasis in this workshop. Now, this is a carefully crafted piece of writing that is essential to your project. You know, the writing of the application, of course, was the thing that got you there in the first place, but the process is still going, and your chances are alive potentially through this. I'll just bring up a point too that came from our recent linkage, and I can say it's a successful linkage, yay. But one of the points that was made by one of the reviewers was, because it was about problem-based learning, it's not new or innovative, it's well established approach to learning and teaching, and it's difficult to see what this project would add to the literature. So that was a strong criticism from one of the assessors there. But we had actually included in our rejoinder about where in the literature that we did have evidence related to this being a new area and it's not well understood. So we had to carefully craft tone in that particular instance to be able to respectfully address that concern of the reviewer. So you can, there's an example of how you can get quite harsh feedback, but learning how to manage that feedback, and it certainly wasn't the feedback from the other assessors that we were able to point to on page 9. We say, you know, there's no shared understanding, etc. So being able to be specific in your application where those aspects can be found as well, I think is important, without saying you're wrong and you're an idiot or something.
Yeah, or you didn't read my application properly.
Exactly. That's right.
I've seen that written, and you instantly go, oh, but if you actually do just as Mandy suggests, point out where it was, then it means that the general assessors will come to the conclusion, oh, this person really didn't pay close attention when they were doing the assessment, because it is there.
Yeah. Yeah, we also had a comment that sounded like the person wanted us to use their particular framework, and while we respectfully acknowledged that, we saw that at this point it wasn't relevant to this project. So it's just that sort of careful dance around the comments that acknowledge that people bring expertise to their viewing of this, and sometimes that's relevant to the proposal, and sometimes it's not as relevant as they might think it is. Yeah.
And particularly because they're often pushing their own barrow.
Yes.
So,
yes.
but again, keep in mind that you're not writing your rejoinder to those detailed assessors, you're writing it to the general assessors. And so that example of Mandy's is really important, because the general assessor will see that, feel the tone in the response, which is it's respectful, but it's not relevant. What the assessor was saying was not relevant to the focus of this particular project. Or it could be that the assessors are that detailed assessor is pushing a barrow for a particular theoretical perspective, which is totally inappropriate. Assessments have to be, you know, done well. Or they could be that the detailed assessor is a bit out of date, and that's also can happen. So because the ARC, I'm sure sometimes are just desperate to get assessors, and so some of them, you know, maybe, I mean, I know most assessors are, you know, have been successful, but I think they've widened the pool in recent years. I'm not really sure, but anyway, I've come across assessments that appear to be a bit dated, and so therefore, when you're responding again, as Mandy was saying, respectfully point that out, and you can say something like, yes, this was very important. This was important literature or problem in the 80s, and over the 90s there was this interesting development, and we're springboarding from that by doing this innovation, this exciting work that we're proposing.
Right. So any more questions or comments that people have?
I don't know whether Jane wants to make a comment. Jane, do you have any things that you'd like to share as well?
Jane Southcott, is that who?
Yes, yes, yep. She's unmuted, so I think she's going to respond.
Okay,
Yes.
I'll mute.
Sorry, I'll turn my video on as well. I was just trying to reduce the bandwidth. Basically, thank you. No, I was fascinated by the rejoinder process because I've been through it, but it was frankly somewhat of a mystery. And you're right, the temptation to be grumpy is really very hard to resist. So thank you. I will take all those very constructive and insightful comments on board when I get some of the current rejoinders. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Sometimes you could be unaware of your tone as well, which is going back to something Marilyn said earlier about get somebody else to read it, because you know that what you think might be straightforward, somebody else might cringe over, so that, you know, that becomes quite essential there. Yeah.
Oh, as a child, my mother always said, send the third version of the letter, never send the first one. Because
Yeah, good advice for a rejoinder as well.
I think it works well. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jane.
An observation, the best one I've ever seen that remains in my memory it is clear that the reviewers have not read the application.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah,
words to that effect, you know.
how to instantly put yourself at the bottom of the pile. So
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
right.
Indeed, indeed, exactly. That's a red rag to a bull for the general assessors.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we're here, of course, in the research office, Sharon, Trudy, and you know, supportive of what you're producing your rejoinder and how we can help you craft it. I guess some of the questions will come when people actually get their reviews back, and then you'll want to watch this recording again and think about, oh, what do I do in this particular situation? So within the next month or so, that's when we anticipate them coming back. And we're really excited that we've had so many applications in the faculty this year across the DPs, the special research initiatives, and also the FECRAs. So good luck to everybody in getting your reviews. Remember, it's just like a journal review. You've got to suck it up and deal with it, no matter how difficult that seems when you might first read it. And if it's any consolation, that very critical comment that came with our linkage, we were still successful. So think about how to be constructively productive in the way that you respond. So thanks again very much, Marilyn. Thanks to
My
Sharon
pleasure.
for organising. That's just great. We really benefit from everybody's expertise and from the comments that we've made, also Paul and Jane, and your questions, because that's what helps to make this a productive session. And yeah, good luck. We'll be waiting with bated breath to hear what happens for people as those assessor reports come out. And so without further ado, I think that's the end of the session. So thanks a lot, everyone. I can see the...
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, goodbye.
Bye, everyone, and good luck.
Thanks, Marilyn.
Thanks, Sharon and Mandy. That was great.
Thanks
And Paul,
very much,
thanks for
Marilyn.
adding